If you have a fall garden, and especially if you are a beginning fall gardener, you may be looking at your beds right now wondering, are these plants even going to produce before the freeze sets in? I have been hearing the same concern over and over again, and after helping 10 gardeners plan their fall gardens for this year, I have seen exactly why this happens, and I know how to prevent it for next time. This is just one example of something that I learned this year after helping people plan their own fall gardens. And I'm going to be sharing with you several different things that I learned that I think will be helpful for you as a fall gardener, whether this is your first year or you've never had a fall garden and you're looking toward the future. So let me give you a little bit of backstory. This fall, I worked one-on-one with 10 gardeners across the country to help them plan their fall gardens. Each one had a different space, they had different zones, and they had different purposes for their fall gardens, different sets of goals. But they were all chasing the same thing, a productive, low stress fall garden. And as I listened to their experiences and as I designed their layouts and their schedules for their particular garden, one thing that I started noticing was that clear patterns with these gardeners, no matter where they were located, started to emerge. Patterns that explain why some fall gardens flourish while others never quite do so well. So, in this episode, I'm going to share with you what I learned from planning those gardens, the mistakes they were making, the adjustments that they were able to make this year that changed everything, and the lessons that you can use in your own garden right now. Now, if you're wondering, how can I get you to plan my next garden? Don't worry, I'll talk to you about a limited time opportunity to get your spring garden planned for you, actually right before the holidays, so that you can finish the holidays already having your spring garden plan in place. I'll talk to you more about that at the very end. But first, let's jump into some lessons that I learned with planning these fall gardens that I really hope will help you in your fall garden, if not this year, then in the years to come. The first lesson was the head and shoulders above the rest lesson because I heard it time and time again from gardeners, and it's the one that I alluded to at the beginning. The lesson is that most of the time, especially with new fall gardeners, they plant too late. Over and over, when I was having these one-on-one conversations with these gardeners, no matter where they were located, from Texas to New York, they realized that they were planting their fall gardens way too late. For example, Laura in New York was telling me that she had previously sown carrot seeds and pea seeds in September because that's when it cools off, but they weren't actually working so great with that timing. So we shifted her schedule about a month before that so that her crops could make it before her days shortened in New York. The same thing happened with Michelle in Texas. She discovered that by the time the fall weather was pleasant, her daylight was slipping away, and that was making a big difference in how her crops grew. So, the takeaway for this for you is to understand that the window for planting fall crops is way earlier than most of us think, especially for slow growing crops like broccoli, cabbage, and carrots. The earlier you start, the more likely you'll have a harvest before the cold or the lack of daylight shuts it down. Now, that leads us to lesson number 2, because you may be thinking, how can I plant these fall crops so early? And this is something that I had to continue to share with people so that they would understand that fall gardening actually starts in the heat, even though it makes no sense why that would be the case. Nearly every gardener that I talked to hesitated to plant when I told them to in August because it's hot, and they were thinking it was too soon or it might be too stressful on young plants. But that's the key. Fall gardening always begins before it feels like fall. I talked to Mimi in Louisiana, and when I was talking to her about when to plant lettuce, she laughed because she doesn't know how that's possible to plant a cool season crop like lettuce when she's still dripping in Louisiana heat and humidity. When I talked to Whitney in Missouri, we talked about how to plant in the evening, how to pre-water the soil, how to add shade cloth, and this would help her seedlings survive those first brutal weeks that were very, very hot. The takeaway then for you kind of piggybacks on lesson number 1, and that's when you're planning and planting your fall garden, don't wait for the weather to cool down. You need to plant while it's still hot, but then protect your seedlings through this transition in some of the ways that I suggested for Whitney. Fall gardens reward those who act early and nurture carefully in those early weeks of the heat, because eventually the heat will break and then the fall crops will be very, very grateful that they're doing the bulk of their growing when they really like the temperature and the weather. Lesson number 3 is to simplify your fall garden, and this will help you to build confidence and joy. What I found with many of the gardeners that I talked to is that they came in overwhelmed by too many options of what they could plant in their fall gardens, or they were overwhelmed by past failures. Maybe they had tried fall gardens in the past and they haven't worked like they had expected. Or also in many cases, when you're planting your fall garden, a lot of times you're exhausted from the summer garden. So overwhelm is very common when it comes to planting the fall garden. The breakthrough came when I talked to many of these gardeners and helped them to focus their energy on just a few crops that mattered the most. When I talked to Tabby in West Virginia, I realized that her priority was to plant crops that she could use for juicing and for fresh salads. By identifying the crops that were most important to her, we were able to center her garden plan around those and then leave off some of the other fall crops that weren't as important to her. That way she had a fall garden that had exactly what was the most important in her life. When I talked to Whitney, she was still discouraged by a tough summer, which a lot of us are. So we talked about what crops would be the most rewarding for her to have in the fall. We chose a smaller set of more easy to succeed crops, enough to remind her that she can do this and that she can grow these fall crops without as much effort when she focuses on what's most important. So the takeaway here is simplifying your plan, deciding, you know what, I'm not going to plant that this year, is not about giving up. It's about creating room for success and being realistic about your current stage of life. And side note, we're going to be talking about that more in next week's episode. Because a smaller, intentional garden often leads to a bigger harvest and renewed confidence. It's okay to scale back and become more strategic about what you grow. You're more likely to be successful, you're less likely to burn out, and you're more able to create a garden that works best for you and your life stage right now. Before we get to the next 3 lessons, I wanted to make sure that you know about 2 timely things going on right now. First is Greenstock Vertical Gardens warehouse clearance event, and it ends today. So this will only apply if you're listening to this on the day this episode drops on October 21st. If you have been eyeing a Greenstock vertical planter, this is the moment to take advantage of their sale right now. I love mine because they water from the top, they drain evenly through each pocket, and they let me tuck in greens, herbs, peppers, lots of different crops in this small space. Setup is really easy, and you can even get trellises and plant supports that help you keep this Greenstock vertical planter tidy and productive. Now, this sale is on specific colors. Some of them they are clearancing out and they're not going to bring back again. So when they're gone, they're gone. But even some limited edition colors are on sale at really good prices. So if you're listening to this by October 21st, go and grab yours at journeywithjill.net/greenstock. And don't forget, you can get $10 off your order of $75 or more with my code JILL10. Also, this is a great opportunity to maybe get some early holiday gifts, especially with the smaller planters like the 3-tier and the 5-tier. They're fantastic for gift giving. The second thing I want to make sure that you know about is that my 2026 Complete Garden Planner, printable garden planner is now available. We try to get that available for you every October. You can go to journeywithjill.net/shop to check that out. This is the planner that I built for real life gardeners. We have space for raised bed layouts, succession planting, seed starting, logs for planting, logs for harvest, weekly planning pages that keep you going. All of this to help you reduce your overwhelm when you're planning and you're growing your garden. So if you're interested in a printable planner that you can customize for your space and your needs, head to journeywithjill.net/shop and you can check this one out. Both links to the Greenstock sale and to the planner are going to be in the show notes, so check that out. All right, moving on to lesson number 4. This is something that I found as I was creating the garden layouts for these 10 gardeners. This lesson is that interplanting changes everything. Across nearly every layout, I was able to find ways to make the same space serve double duty. And what I found was almost all of the gardeners that I worked with, they did not realize how much they could actually fit in their space. They would tell me what they wanted to plant, but they would be like, I'm not quite sure that I can fit all of this in. But by strategically interplanting certain crops, I was able to get lots more plants in their space than they thought was possible. Pairing slow maturing crops like your broccoli and your cabbage next to quick ones like salad greens gave gardeners early harvest, but also better use of light and soil. And the more you plant in your garden, the less weeding you're going to have to do because the plants will shade out the soil, which is a definite bonus. For example, with Tabby in West Virginia, one thing I found myself doing over and over again was if I had a gardener that wanted both cabbage and baby greens or broccoli and baby greens or lettuce greens or something like that, I would make this square foot garden plan and every other square would have either the cabbage or the broccoli or the cauliflower, and then the other squares would be the early baby greens. And what this means is that those baby greens are going to germinate really quickly, they're going to grow really fast, and they're going to get a head start before the cabbage and the broccoli and the cauliflower take over that space. So you're able to get an early harvest of greens when you do it this way, and that way you can have an entire bed full of double the amount of crops as compared to just doing cabbage or broccoli every other square with nothing in between. This is something that I do in my own garden, and I've found it's been such a benefit to be able to maximize this space. When we're talking about the fall garden and the spring garden too, for that matter, I don't want any square foot to sit empty. And quick crops, shallow rooted crops like these lettuce greens can be planted right next to slower growing crops. They can share the same space. And then right as one is finishing, like these greens, the other one, like broccoli and cabbage, can take over that space. It's a perfect pairing to be able to get more crops out of the same harvest. Lesson number 5 is that sunlight and microclimates are very important to consider in the fall garden. As we head into shorter days and the sun gets to a lower angle, this makes fall sunlight very different from the spring. Several gardeners hadn't realized how much shade would creep in until we started mapping it out. For example, Julianne in Washington had to work around an arborvitae wall, which created shade. And then those arborvitae roots were creeping into her garden. So she had some issues with that. So what we did is I mapped out her garden where the crops that needed more sun, like carrots and broccoli, those went in the beds that were further away from the arborvitae wall. They were able to get as much sun as possible. While the greens that are more shallow rooted and could tolerate a little bit more shade, those were put in the beds that were closer to the shade of that wall and to the roots that were invading her garden space. Another example is Serena in Tennessee. She had a Greenstock vertical planter, and one thing that I did for her is I put her more heat-sensitive crops in the lower shaded levels of the Greenstock vertical planter, especially early in the season when it was really hot, and the more heat-tolerant crops went in the upper part of the Greenstock. That way, the crops that are on the lower end could benefit from more of the shade earlier in. The takeaway here is to understand how your sun is tracking in the sky and what kind of angles you're looking at when it comes to full sun crops, but also consider shade and how early in the season the natural shade that you have may actually benefit some of your crops, especially leafy greens. A theme that kept emerging with so many of the gardeners that I spoke with were a fear of doing it wrong. And I get it. That is something that we all worry about. We don't want to pour our time and our energy and our money into something that's just going to be a total failure or a total waste. But what I wanted to help to do is to reframe this mindset of understanding that anything that you do in your fall garden, even if you do plant things too late, like I talked about in lesson 1, you're able to observe what happened. And that's what I loved about talking to some of these gardeners who had gardened in the fall before. They knew what went wrong, or they could at least tell me. I would plant and it just never did anything. So I would ask, when did you plant before? And then they were able to tell me when, and I was able to tell them, okay, this is why. Let's back this up, and then let's see if we have a better experience. And I've had them since then tell me, I planted earlier like you told me to, and especially with broccoli, and I have heads this time. But you could think of those previous experiences as failures or doing it wrong, and I guess technically that could be correct, but think about the lessons that are learned even in that. So understanding that in the fall garden in particular, observation is so important. Understanding that how a crop behaves relative to day length and temperature, sun, even rainfall, that gives us information that will help us to become better gardeners in the future, especially in the fall garden when observation is so important. Because one thing that I did notice about all of these gardeners is that no matter where they were located, no matter what part of the country they were located in, for the most part, their plant timing was very similar. I was actually kind of surprised because if I were to do a spring garden for each of those gardeners, I guarantee you their planting times would be very different. When you're comparing New York to Western Washington in the Pacific Northwest to Texas to West Virginia, those plant timings are going to be very different in the spring. But what I found is that the plant timings were a lot more similar in the fall. However, it's really important to observe, to adjust, because when it comes to the day length, we're losing it so fast in the fall that even adjusting a planting time by a week will make a big difference in the fall garden, a bigger difference probably in the fall garden than even in the spring. And here's the takeaway. Anytime we work a garden plan, we need to understand that it's simply a guide. It's not a rule book. The best gardeners watch, observe, adapt, and learn every season. And they don't put all of their eggs in one basket thinking that it's either failure or success. And they understand that any kind of learning is actually going to help them become better gardeners in the future. And that was one thing I just really wanted to hammer home with all of these gardeners, is that they can do it, but they also need to continue observing so they can learn more and more with each season. Now, after designing these 10 gardens, one truth stood out. Clear planning turns uncertainty into confidence. Yes, the plan isn't a rule book, it is a guide, but it gives you confidence to know what you need to do, when you need to do it, where you're going to plant, and why. Every gardener that I talked to entered the season after I presented their plan, knowing exactly what they wanted to plant, when they needed to plant it, and how many to plant, and then also how to make adjustments along the way. And that confidence is something that I want for you too. That's why this month in October, I'm opening 12 spots for my Done For You garden plans. Just like I planned these gardens in the fall, I am going to be doing the same thing for the spring. But because these plans take several hours to do, I'm only offering 12 spots at this point. And since I record these podcast episodes about a week in advance, it is possible those spots could already be filled, but it's possible there are still spots available. So you can head to the link in the show notes. If this is something that you're interested in letting me do for you, you can check that out. And if all the 12 spots were filled, there will be a wait list just in case we are able to open up any more. And just so you know, each customized garden plan will include a custom layout fit to your space, a personalized planting calendar, and a detailed week by week guide tailored to your garden space and your climate so that you can head into the spring knowing that everything is all mapped out for you and ready to go. So if this is something that you're interested in, you can find all the details and a sign up link in the show notes. As always, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed in your podcast player to get next week's episode dropping as soon as it is published. And in next week's episode, we're going to continue the What I Learned series. Today was what I learned with planning 10 fall gardens. And next week is what I learned about adjusting my garden to a different stage of life. And this is going to be another real life episode because I don't know that I have all the answers yet, but I can share with you a lot of what I'm going through as I'm trying to adjust to a new phase of life. And I hope it'll be something that you can relate to as well. So I look forward to talking with you in next week's episode. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll chat with you next Tuesday.